a pretty formidable economic constraint in and of itself. But there's an even more formidable economic constraint that looms ahead in the future. And that's the environmental constraint, that we have now crossed over 400 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere. The world scientific community has been telling us for quite some time that we cannot allow carbon to continue to build in the atmosphere, that the atmosphere cannot be viewed as a garbage dump for carbon emissions, because if we do that, the increase in carbon in the atmosphere is going to raise global temperatures to levels that are potentially cataclysmic for many regions of the world. The consensus has been that we have to stabilize carbon at about 450 parts per million. And even with that, we're going to get about a 2-degree rise in global temperatures. We've already had slightly under 1. If we don't, if we go on with business as usual and continue to rely on coal, nat gas, and oil to power global economic growth, that we're not going to see a 2-degree rise in temperature. We're going to see anywhere from a 4 to 5 degree rise in temperature that would have, for many areas of the world, particularly the 700 million people who live in coastal populations, including Vancouver, cataclysmic consequences from rising sea levels, not to talk about the drought in major agricultural areas and the increasing challenge of feeding what is now 7 billion, what will be then 9 billion people. So, if it's not business as usual, if we're going to draw the line at 450 parts carbon, what does that imply about the future trend of consumption of fossil fuels? Well, that's a very interesting question, and one that the International Energy Agency, which is probably the world's authority on energy usage, modeled back in 2012. And they calculated that if we are going to stabilize carbon at 450 parts per million, then in the next 2 decades, world coal consumption would have to fall by roughly 1/3, and world oil consumption would have to fall from today, right at 93 million barrels a day, to about 80 million barrels a day, or about 15%. Well, that's a very different world than what you would find in the prospectus of a coal company or an oil company. They would tell you that, that we're going to continue to see steady increases in world oil consumption and world coal consumption. What happens if we're facing declines? And let's just put those declines in perspective. During the Great Recession, where oil prices went from $147 to $40, there was a 3.5% decline in world oil consumption. We're talking about a 15% decline in world oil consumption. And in the recession, that was even the deepest recession is a temporary 5-6 quarter phenomena, and oil consumption came right back. We're talking about no comeback in world oil consumption, a permanent decline.